Good evening and welcome to Q&A live from Melbourne. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions tonight. Political and military advisor turned author Catherine McGregor. Canadian author Jordan Peterson, whose 12 Rules for Life and Stand Against Political Correctness made him a philosophy rock star. Labor frontbencher Terry Butler. The federal government's Special Minister of State, Alex Hawke, and writer, activist and Twitter queen, Van Badham. Please welcome our panel. Let's go straight to our very first questions from Dean Troth.
My question is for Professor Peterson. Professor Peterson, your rise to global stardom appears to be based largely on, I guess, the millions of people in the West who've been disenfranchised, whose worlds have been rocked and worldviews have been cracked by global movements that they are powerless to influence. Movements like socialism, globalism and feminism. People, particularly young men, appear to regard you and look to you as a saviour. What do you think they believe they need saving from?
Jordan Peterson, welcome to Australia.
Well, it's funny to regard me as a saviour because what I tell people consistently is that they have to look to themselves. And it's not because I believe that people are in full control of their lives. You know, we're all subject to bad breaks and sometimes to terrible luck, but your best bet is to do what you can, to take care of yourself properly, to treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping, which is rule 2, by the way, partly because I do believe in this ancient, fundamentally Western idea that people are of intrinsic value. I mean, look, we're all given the sovereign right to organize our own states, the responsibility to vote. Our very state assumes that you have the wisdom to keep the ship of state sailing straight. And it's because there's something about you that, at least in principle, has the possibility of being remarkable if it can be manifested. And I'm reminding people that not only do we believe that, but that it seems to be true. And it isn't obvious to me that there is anyone, or there has been anyone for the last 4 or 5 decades, let's say, who's done a credible job of drawing a relationship between the meaning in life that you need to sustain you and responsibility. And not just for you, because it's not an individualistic idea. It's responsibility for you and your family
Coming up to
and your community. That'll do the trick. And your broader society.
Let me just, before we move on to the other panellists, can I just draw you to the final part of the question, because there's this fascination that many young men have for your message. And I guess he's suggesting, our questioner there, that's something to do with them needing saving from socialism, globalism and feminism. Is there any truth to that in your mind?
Well, there is truth to the idea that they might need a certain amount of existential rescuing from the idea that the West is fundamentally best characterized as an oppressive patriarchy, which is absolutely absurd proposition, and that as a consequence, whatever actions they might take that are forthright and ambitious in terms of participating in that system are by the very nature of the system destructive. It's very difficult for me to understand how anybody can be properly motivated if that's the fundamental view of society and male participation in it. And I don't buy any of that. I think the idea that the West is fundamentally an oppressive patriarchy is an appalling idea, and the notion that the proper way to view history is as a battleground between ethnic identities or identities in general, or between men and women, it borders on the pathological. And so maybe it exceeds just merely bordering on the pathological.
Let's go around the panel on that, because there's plenty of time and other questions to explore that. Van Badham.
Well, I mean, Alex, I think that it's almost as though we're talking about a structural issue and you're talking about a personal issue. And people who take personally the idea that we need to change structures, I think are misreading what the complaint is that people have. And so for me, the problem that I have with kind of structural rigidity of gender roles for men and women is that they hurt men and they hurt women. They hurt both. They hurt the men who want to stay home longer with their kids. They hurt men in real physical ways, because we do have a problem in this country where women are more likely to be the victims of violence at home. Men are more likely to be the victims of violence in public But in both, the common factor is it's men committing the violence by and large, not exclusively, but by and large. And so these rigid kind of ideas of masculinity hurt everyone. And so when we talk about feminism, when we talk about changing those structures, it's to create an equality for the benefit of everyone and to get rid of some of the things that hold everyone back.
Do you want a brief response to that, by the way?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I'm not anti-feminist per se. I mean, I think the idea that the world would benefit from the movement of talent from both sexes into the workplace as rapidly as possible is something that anyone with any sense should share, given the the rarity of talent and the necessity for utilizing it. I do stand by my original statement, though, that there's a brand of more radical feminism that insists that our culture is best characterized as an oppressive patriarchy, and I think that, first of all, that's an appalling sociological doctrine, and I think it has very negative psychological effects. And they won't be limited to men, because if it's true that there's something toxic, let's say, about masculinity per se, what that will inevitably mean is that as women adopt more masculine roles, traditionally, what is that toxicity somehow going to go away?
But that's a straw man, because no one says there's anything toxic about masculinity per se.
What do you mean no one says that? The term exists.
No.
How is that a straw man? Well, where did the term come from?
It's a phrase that's used about forms of masculinity that are harmful to men and women. It's not about masculinity per se. You must know that.
I read the American Psychological Association guidelines for the treatment of boys and men, and I know perfectly well that this is no straw man. And it's not only devoted towards what you might describe as the more aggressive ends of masculine behavior. It's aimed at masculinity in a much broader range of. There's a much broader range of accusations that are under the surface than that. And so I don't see in what way at all that it's a straw man.
I'm just going to pause that argument for a second and go to the next question is a video. It's from Milo Yiannopoulos in Miami.
Hey, Dr. Peterson, it's Milo Yiannopoulos. You talk a good game about standing up for men and for boys, and you've certainly amassed a big army of them. But a few of us have been wondering recently, with your silence on Kavanaugh, your silence on the innocent Covington boys, and then when you've said things like, for instance, when you told the New York Times' Barry Weiss that you thought I might be a racist when you know I'm not, that perhaps your actions aren't matching your words. Can you explain why, although you talk a good game about standing up against social justice warriors and the chaotic feminine, that when it actually comes down to it, you always seem to either fold, stay silent, or betray your allies?
Jordan.
Is that live? Haven't seen Milo for quite a long time.
It's like the intruder on Q&A.
Well, first of all, I don't believe that I'm obliged to comment on absolutely everything that happens everywhere in the world. And I don't think that I am betraying my fundamental base. With regards to what happened with Barry and Milo. Milo, I'd probably just as soon apologize to you for that. I don't think that I did defend you very well at that particular time. I don't believe that you're a racist. It was a question that caught me off guard in an audience that was exceptionally hostile and surreal. And so insofar as that might be helpful to you, I'd offer you an apology for that. I don't think the rest of your accusations are warranted, however. So that's what I'd like to say.
Do you see...
I did, by the way, also, Milo, invite you to talk, about a year and a half ago when things first started to collapse around you, and we never did get around to that, and I don't believe that was entirely my fault.
We're not going to hear back from him, just a video, but nonetheless. Do you see him and people like him as being in some sort of competition online for the hearts and minds of young men in particular? Because he obviously sees it as a competition.
Well, I don't really see that I'm in competition with anybody particularly. I'm not trying to be in competition with anybody. And I'm also, by the way, not trying to talk to young men. I mean, one of the things, not specifically, I'm perfectly happy to be doing that. And by the way, they're not all that young. I think the average age is somewhere near 35. I'm trying to talk to people. And like as a university professor, 80% of my students approximately were women, and that was the case for 30 years. And at least 50% of my colleagues have been women. And there's been this idea generated in the news by news people who keep reading the news that other news people create, that somehow I have a coterie of angry, young, white men surrounding me because they're angry about feminism and about all these other isms, let's say. And I don't see it like that at all. I'm trying to suggest to people that their best bet in life, and this is men and women alike, is to adopt as much responsibility as they can for their own lives. And I went through this already because that's where the meaning in life is to be found. And the notion that that's somehow a message that's limited to young men it's an absurd message. Okay. Why would that be limited?
Not to kind of interrupt your flow, but your minute's up.
Okay.
But also, oddly enough, we have a question from a young man. Ulysses Reed has a question for you.
With modern feminism fighting for equality between the genders, why is it that some self-proclaimed feminists would rather ignore the issues men face when it comes to gender inequality? Why aren't they doing more to address issues such as how many fathers don't get joint or any custody of their children at all, or how men are statistically more likely to commit suicide? Why do so many people either disregard this information when seeking to end gender inequality, or not even acknowledge that this is, in fact, a problem?
Van, we'll start with you. But Jordan, go ahead.
Well, I think we don't address a lot of this systematically. We talk a lot about equality, but there's various forms of equality. There's equality of opportunity, which we discussed briefly, which I think is a very admirable goal. And then there's equality of outcome, which I think is it's an impossible. I think it's a totalitarian impossibility, and I think it's often conflated with equality of opportunity. Equality of outcome, of course, is the doctrine that every occupation should be occupied by people in precise proportion to their proportionality in the population.
So quotas in politics, for example, or quotas in business as to how many women should be on boards, how many women should be politicians, that's what you're talking about.
Yes, quotas on the basis of group identity. Let's say, so for example, in Canada, our Prime Minister, an enlightened soul, decided that he would make 50% of the cabinet women, despite the fact that only 25% of the people who were elected in his party were female, which meant certainly from a statistical perspective that he did not hire the most qualified people for the cabinet. And he did that to virtue signal to his base. And it turned out to be a very big mistake.
That's your minute, by the way. So we'll come back to these.
This is a question for the panel, but mostly for Jordan Peterson. Do you believe that a stay-at-home full-time mother is adequately valued in today's society? As a stay-at-home mother myself, I don't feel valued by wider society, as most of what I hear focuses on women getting back to work as soon as possible. And you don't hear anything about the benefit of staying home and the benefit for the children.
Jordan Peterson, start with you.
Well, I certainly noticed that when my wife had small kids, and we used to go out together, and of course I had the small kids too. But it was, I stated it that way for a purpose. When we would go to restaurants and so forth together, she was often treated with less respect than she would have been had the kids not been with her, and that was very bothersome because it's quite a sacrifice and a very useful sacrifice to have small children, and people who have them should be treated with respect. I think that we do an awful lot of lying to women in our society, and I think that's a better answer to your question because I think the data indicates this too, that
what kind of lies do you mean, Jordan?
That career is the most important thing in life and is most likely to be the case that way for men and for women. I think it is important for more men than for women because women take the primary role for very early child rearing. But it's clearly the case, as far as I can tell, that for most people, and the statistics bear this out, that family is by far the most important commitment that people make in their lives. And I think we lie to 18 to 19-year-old women non-stop, especially in universities and educational institutions.
That's your minute, by the way, sorry.
By telling them that career is going to be the fundamental purpose, give the fundamental purpose to their life. And for most people, that's simply not the case, nor should it be.
Terry Butler, going straight to the question. The next question comes from Kath Larkin.
Hi, my question is also for Peterson, and while I very much stand with the women's advocates in the room, my question is sort of on a different topic. You have a whole lot of fans or former fans, kind of so-called now ex-lobsters, people like Brendan Schiff. And a lot of these people talk about you have very simple answers to complex questions. You know, I think you often talk about individual responsibility over things that it's impossible for individuals to actually have responsibility over. You look at the extortionate housing market, the precarious gig economy, like things that are well out of our control. So I want to know, what is your answer to young people for some of the really big problems facing humanity, like the climate catastrophe, like economic crisis, like the precarious job market? Because I just don't, you talk all this much about individual responsibility. Most of us are never going to be able to afford to have all of these assets to have responsibility over. So what is your advice beyond banal comments like clean your room?
Well, it's actually rather difficult to answer a question that ends with your comments are banal politely. So, I would consider that more of an opinionated personal and political statement than actually a question. So why don't you try reformulating that so that there's an actual question there?
What is your... So what is your advice to young people when you talk about you need to be individually responsible, but when there are things that are so far out of our control, like climate catastrophe, like the precarious job economy, like the
They're not
economic
as far
crisis?
out of your control as you think.
What is your answer to
Do you think
people
that
who
you're
are
worse
facing
off
these
than
questions?
you think that you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think there are different challenges.
Do you think you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think that...
Jordan, once again, we're not going to cross-examine our questioners. So try answering the question about collective responsibility on climate change, for example. Pick one part of that, because the argument, I think, is that individual responsibility does not change the climate, does not fix the problem that needs global collective responsibility. So I think that's the core of the question. Do you have a theory about that?
Well, fundamentally, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been that people can do a tremendous amount of good for themselves and for the people who are immediately around them by looking to their own inadequacies and their own flaws and the things that they're not doing in their lives and starting to build themselves up as more powerful individuals. And if they're capable of doing that, then they're capable of expanding their career. And if they're capable of expanding their career and their competence, then they're capable of taking their place in the community as effective leaders. And then they're capable of making wise decisions instead of unwise decisions when it comes to making collective political decisions. I'm not suggesting in the least, and have never suggested, that there's no domain for social action. I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world, which happens in many ways.
Can I just if a young person believes that the climate, the global warming problem on the climate is something that needs to be tackled quickly, and they can't wait until they grow up and become prime ministers to do it, do you think collective responsibility overrides individual responsibility in a huge issue like that?
No.
Okay.
I don't. I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbours. That's what it looks like.
All right. Okay, Catherine, jumping. Next question comes from Craig Pett.
Martin Luther King's dream was that there would come a time when people would not be judged by the colour of their skin but by the content of their character. How is today's identity politics consistent with that vision?
Jordan Peterson.
Well, I don't think it's consistent with that vision at all. I mean, the problem I have with identity politics as a mode of philosophical apprehension is that it's predicated on the idea that the appropriate way to classify people is by their group identity in whatever fragmentary formulation that might take. in the multiplicity of ways that people can be divided into groups. And the classical postmodern, and I would also say Marxist way of viewing the world, even though those two things shouldn't be allowed together, they tend to be, is that group identity takes priority over individual identity. And I think that's precisely the opposite of what Martin Luther King was hoping for and working for. And I think it's unbelievably dangerous, partly because when you assume that people should primarily be identified by their group, then you can also attribute group guilt to them by their group. And then things go downhill very, very rapidly. And we've had no shortage of evidence of that sort of thing happening, say, throughout the 20th century.
Are there particular groups that you are more concerned about than others? For example, the Liberal Party, as Terry Butler said earlier, is a group. Are there groups that you think are more dangerous?
There isn't a problem with groups. The problem is with assuming that the fundamental way that you should categorize people is with their group identity. Obviously, we all belong to groups. The issue is whether or not the individual identity is primary and the group identity is secondary, or the group identity is primary and the individual identity is secondary. If you're a proponent, for example, of equality of outcome, of quotas, then you de facto accept the proposition that it's the group identity that is primary, and there's all sorts of dangers that are associated with that far outweigh whatever good you're likely to do.
Okay,
Or maybe you just...
Go ahead.
Or maybe you just think that representative democracy should be representative. Maybe you just think that women should be equally represented in the decision-making fora of our nation. Maybe that's really just about having proper equality in a body that's meant to be representative.
Well, I do believe that women should have... I don't understand your question, I guess.
I guess you don't. That's pretty obvious, unfortunately.
Well, how about if you phrase it more clearly, instead of just insulting me? Look at it this way. Let's talk about quotas for a minute. So there's a very wide array of jobs that are fundamentally done by men. So, for example,
Member of Parliament,
99.9% of
sorry, Alex, I'm going to
bricklayers.
stop sledging you now, I promise.
I'm happy to give my minute to Jordan.
99.9% of bricklayers are men. Should we have quotas for women?
Is bricklaying representative democracy?
That has nothing to do with the question. The question is if there's evidence of structural inequality and oppression because women aren't precisely represented at 50% in all professions at all levels, then why don't we have a conversation about having women represented in all professions at all levels? Why do we talk about the C-suite, for example? Why do we talk about politics and positions of power? Why don't we talk about it across the board?
Okay, so let's just pause and...
yeah, but that's because it's power.
You pose a question to Terry Butler. Go ahead and answer it, then we'll hear from the other panellists.
His question to me?
Well, yeah, if you'd,
about
like,
bricklayers.
if you'd like to answer the question about bricklayers.
There's nothing wrong with bricklayers.
Why there are no
Of course
quotas in
there's not.
It's
just...
I think you were trying to draw a distinction between bricklaying and running the government.
And I was suggesting that a representative democracy should be representative. That was the point I made. And I don't think...
Representative of it by quota?
Well, sure, if that's what it takes. I mean,
yeah,
it's
well,
worked
that's
for
exactly
us.
what you would say.
But you know, I can...
That just means a dreadful strategic inadequacy on your part.
The Liberal Party steered away from quotas.
I'm loath to interrupt
and
this.
the women are steering away from the Liberal
I'm actually
Party.
quite enjoying this. I'm loath to interrupt.
A related question. It's from Peter Sheehy. Peter.
Thanks, Tony. This is for Jordan initially. There has been an increasing trend here in Australia that anyone who has a counter view to the socialists, PC, lobby, Greens, Communist Brigade
your friend
on national television right
shouted
now.
Down
literally
and called racists or homophobics, so that any form of rational debate is difficult, if not impossible, to now have. How can we counter this?
Peter, I assume you're making an exception. You're making an exception for Q&A, I dare say, because we are having that debate as we speak.
But I haven't been shouted down.
There you go.
So you're making progress, Tony.
Jordan Peterson.
Or you're wrong. Possibly you're just wrong.
Jordan Peterson.
Well, look, I've been called every pejorative in the book, I think, except pedophile. But, well, I've tried to keep track of them. One day last year, I was called a Jewish shill and a Nazi the same day, which was, I guess, a high point. Your claim that if we engage in certain types of discussions, this kind of reaction emerges is absolutely the case. I mean, for at least 6 months after I made what you might describe as my initial political stance, I was swarmed by people who were using every possible pejorative to take me out so that none of my arguments needed to be taken seriously. How do we deal with that? Well, hopefully we stop calling each other cheap names. That would be a nice start, rather than addressing the issues. But I would also say a certain amount of persistence is called for. If you're mobbed on social media, a brief bit of advice by people who are doing exactly the sort of thing that you're describing, I would say 2 things. The first is be careful about what you've said and what you've said in the past, and maybe it's a bit too late for that. The second thing I would say is, if you haven't done anything wrong, do not apologize.
That is your minute.
And then wait 2 weeks, and it'll go away.
Terry Butler. Come to you. Terry first. Go ahead. Do you accept any truth to the basis of the question from your point of view?
I mean, my job is I go and hear different points of views all the time. All I hear is debate. All I hear is people with different opinions. I just don't accept that you can't have an opinion in this country without being shouted down. I mean, it just seems so silly.
We've had a number of right-wing people come to this country, and then they've had their venues targeted. They've had to leave the country because of the radicals of the left that won't let them put a point of view that's different to the socialist left. And it's getting worse. I've got a lot of grey hair.
Sure.
This didn't happen in this country 15 years ago.
I have to say I've got a lot too, but it's pretty well dyed in my case. We have right here on national television tonight Professor Jordan Peterson, whom you might know is a figure of some controversy, and I say that with respect. I don't mean it in a pejorative way, but is a figure of some...
Sounds a little pejorative to me.
Is a figure of some...
Especially given the company that you put me in.
Well, I don't know which company he's talking about, but we're here having a very civilised conversation, I think, and there's people having very different views. I don't think it's true that people can't say things in this country, and I think that those who say that are going to have, I think, a very disproportionate impact on whether people are willing to speak out. If you keep telling people they can't say things, they can't ventilate ideas, which is what you're doing, then they're going to be scared to do it. So you need to take responsibility, personal responsibility, I would venture.
So which country do you live in again?
The next question comes from, it actually takes us back in a sense to where Jordan Peterson's prominence began. Comes from Tara Parkhill.
Yes, this is directed towards Jordan Peterson. You stated before to the BBC that by adhering to people's preferred pronouns, that it's the starting point to an authoritarian regime or society. Is it possible, however, that it's more about giving people more rights and liberty, or even something as fundamental as respect?
Jordan.
Well, I never said that. What I said was that I wasn't going to allow the contents of my speech to be dictated by a virtue-signalling government, when never in the history of an English common law society had a government dared to regulate the actual voluntary contents of someone's speech except in a commercial situation.
Just explain, Jordan, to those in the audience who don't know precisely what you're talking about, what it was the government of Canada tried to legislate.
The provincial and Canadian, they did legislate it. The provincial and Canadian government, or the provincial and federal governments in Canada, mandated the use of personal pronouns and made it a criminal offence not to use them, at least under some circumstances. And there's been a variety of negative consequences of that, including the persecution of a teaching assistant at a university known as Wilfrid Laurier. And it isn't a matter of respect at all. And look, in the 1940s, the American Supreme Court, and Americans have a very tight, what would you call, control or tight respect for free speech, decided that it was not constitutional for the government to place mandatory requirements on what people were required to utter in terms of their voluntary speech. There are certain things you can't say, but the government's not to mandate what you have to say. And respect and altruism and all of that is completely irrelevant as far as I'm concerned.
So just to clarify that point, if the government had said, made it a kind of voluntary thing, but with advice that that's what should happen, would you have gone along with that?
Well, they've been doing that for years,
Yeah.
and I'm perfectly... look, I've dealt with all sorts of people in my life. I treat people very politely, as a matter of course. If I'm dealing with someone reasonable, I address them in the manner that seems to be most appropriate to the social situation and most conducive to their, let's say, well-being mutually agreed upon. But as soon as the government decides that they have the right to decide what I have to say because of some false altruism on their part or some underlying and unexpressed ideology, then the answer to that is no damn way.
Catherine McGregor. The next question comes via Skype, and it's from Gabrielle Casey in Greystanes in New South Wales. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Tony. Thanks. My question's to Catherine and also to the whole panel. But so one thing I've noticed is that the topic of human dignity seems to be one that the whole panel agrees on. That people, whether in groups or in as individuals, we have dignity. My question is, do you believe in God? Because as a Catholic, especially, I don't see any other way where we can have a universal dignity beyond there being a God who's created us.
Jordan, I've actually heard you ask this question a number of times, and I don't think I've ever heard you give a definitive answer.
Yeah, I don't like the question.
Yeah. How come?
Well, I don't know exactly. I think part of it
is
too
because, personal?
Yeah, I think it's private. You know, there's a statement in the Old Testament about the what would you call it? Immorality of praying in public, let's say, to make known your good works, your faith, because of the benefits that might confer upon you that have absolutely nothing to do with the moral actions that might allow you to truly deserve them. I mean, I think of religious matters a lot. I would consider myself a deeply religious person. I would say, and I have said this before, that I act as if God exists and that I'm terrified that he might. But I don't consider myself an authority on metaphysical issues, and I don't believe that my belief in God it's not something that seems to me to be fit for... There's something wrong that I can't put my finger on triumphantly declaiming my belief in one manner or another. And so it's something that I prefer to leave in the manner that I've left it. So I act as if God exists. I try to do my best as a person who's obsessed with religious matters. But I'm not willing to place myself conveniently in a box. And so I'm going to leave it at that.
Fair enough. The next question, we really are running out of time. We've got time for one last question. Tom Seamer, go ahead.
Actually, I've been listening to everybody. Actually, I want to totally change my questions, but I'll keep it to what it is. And so this is a question to Professor Peterson. Since you said that trying to improve things, that about how things can go terribly wrong, and even if you have good conditions, is it easier for things to go wrong than things to go right? But the question is to you, why are conservatives called all kinds of names demeaning humanity, vandalized, harassed, and simply just because they're cautious? And so I'll break it down real simpler. Because if I wore, I wouldn't do it, but what if I were to wear a Trump hat? How many people would punch me? How many people would be... See, I was in American politics for 3 years. My dad, he's a lobbyist in New York and Washington, D.C. So what if I wore a Trump hat? How would you respond? In this room, how many people would respond in this room? That's my question. How would you respond if I wore a Trump hat? Professor Peterson.
First question. First question. I think you've made history there. I don't think anyone's actually acted out their question quite that way.
Well, 50% of the Americans voted for Trump, approximately. Which has been about the same, right, for the last 4 or 5 elections. It's pretty much a 50-50 split. It seems to me that there's no excuse whatsoever for vilifying someone for wearing a piece of clothing that indicates alignment with, well, in this particular situation, with the elected majority. And it does happen, and it's appalling. And I think mostly it's a consequence of a very small number of very well-organized, very radical people who have far more power for reasons that have a fair bit to do with the universities than they should. However, having said that, I would say the Trump types and the Republicans in the U.S. are doing a pretty good job of hanging on to their fair share of power, and that my observation in the U.S. is that the political system there is actually quite nicely balanced. And so despite the fact that, you've run into personal trouble for the sorts of things that you're describing, the political debate between the right and the left, which is a very important debate, seems to be moving forward in a manner that indicates the fundamental robustness of the institutions of democracy in the United States. And I think that's the case in most of the Western world. So I don't think that there's any reason to despair on a broader scale, even though you may have encountered some things that were quite nasty personally.
We'll end on that optimistic note. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel: Catherine McGregor, Jordan Peterson, Terry Butler, Alex Hawke and Dan Badham.